Happy Halloween. Welcome to this special Halloween episode of Ghostly Japan. Tonight's episode will be a little different. On this ghoulish evening, I would like to share the story of the origin of the Onibaba of Adachigahara. There are many variations of this story, but this is my take on it. Afterwards, we'll have a very brief discussion about where the story comes from, some of the differences in the most common variations of the story, and some real-life locations that are tied to it. Tonight on Ghostly Japan. Our story begins long, long ago, before the neon lights of Tokyo, long before even the age of the samurai. Far in Japan's ancient past, in the old imperial capital of Kyoto, there once was a woman named Iwate. She was a wet nurse to a noble family of some standing in the city. She had already served the family honorably for some time when the family welcomed their first daughter. However, there was something wrong with the infant. Iwate was the first to notice, for she had experience with raising her own daughter. Iwate noticed the young noble didn't cry or make any sort of noise at all, and while the young noble seemed to have a sweet disposition, she seemed generally uninterested in the world around her. As the years passed, the young noble's condition became more pronounced. She never developed the ability to speak, had trouble walking, and frequently became ill. The noble lord of the house became very concerned, and expended considerable treasure to bring the best physicians across Japan to examine his daughter. The doctors would examine the young noble and rub their chins in frustration. None of them could definitively answer what was ailing the young lady. Their prescriptions of various ground-up medicinal roots or salves had no effect on the girl. With each passing year, more doctors, more medicines, and the young girl's condition only worsened. The lord of the house was growing quite desperate, and the family's treasure was being drained. Iwate had grown quite fond of the young noble. Her sweet disposition had endeared her to the wet nurse, and Iwate treated the girl as if she were her own daughter. The next year, a terrible disease swept the city. It began with the court in panic, because a rickshaw driver had recounted a strange story. He had been approached by a mysterious young girl dressed in a red kimono at an inn outside the city. The girl offered to pay handsomely to engage his services. She opened a purse gleaming with gold coins. Enchanted by the promise of a handsome reward, he didn't bother to question how a young girl would have such a fortune. He happily gave the girl a ride into the city, but as soon as he entered through the gates, the girl vanished from his rickshaw. A Hososhin, a god of smallpox, had arrived. It wasn't long before cases of the disease began to show up. Unfortunately, Iwate's daughter was one of the ones stricken with the terrible blight. In light of Iwate's loyalty and service to the family, the lord of the house paid to have doctors come to treat Iwate's daughter. Some doctors prescribed special diets. Others said to surround the sick daughter with red-colored objects to scare off the smallpox spirit. One said to buy a dog as it would ward off the bad spirit ailing the girl. None of their treatments worked, and Iwate's daughter was soon on death's door. Iwate asked the Lord for a short reprieve from her duties so she could take her daughter to a mystic in the mountains, who had reportedly had some success treating the disease. The Lord understood Iwate's plight better than anyone, since he had felt the same way about his own daughter. He gave Iwate permission and sent a few servants with her to help her. It was an arduous trip through the city, passing the bodies of people who had passed from the disease lined up in the streets awaiting collection. The social order breaking down as people broke into merchants' shops. Iwate worried that some evil men would attempt to rob them, but they were able to navigate the city unmolested. No one wanted to come close to Iwate's daughter, her face scabbed and pocked with blisters. After several days' travel, they made it to the mystic's hut in the mountains. Iwate's daughter was unresponsive and barely alive. They carried her limp body into the hut and set it on the ground. The mystic looked over her body, nodded knowingly, and then turned to Iwate. The old mystic explained Iwate's daughter's condition was grave, but they had arrived just in time. They negotiated payment, It would take every last coin Iwate had saved up, and then the mystic got to work. He concocted a strange potion from medicinal roots and other things that were generally unrecognizable to Iwate. He then tended to the daughter throughout the night, but by morning the girl had made a miraculous recovery. Not even one small smallpox scar blemished the daughter's skin. It was a miracle. Iwate and her daughter left the mystic's hut amazed and euphoric. Iwate and the group returned to the noble family estate, where the noble lord expressed his shock that Iwate's daughter was alive and in such astounding condition. He had fully expected Iwate to return with her daughter's corpse to be buried. This was an unexpected surprise, but a welcome one. The lord immediately ordered that the mystic be brought to the house at any cost. This man who had managed to save Iwate's daughter obviously was no ordinary mystic. Perhaps he could do what all the doctors and holy men could not for his own daughter. A party was immediately dispatched to bring the mystic back. A few days later they returned with the old man. They had had to pay the man a princely sum to make the trip, but the lord of the house spared no expense. The mystic looked over the noble daughter. His examination took longer than Iwate's daughter had. Finally the mystic nodded and looked up. He announced that this was no ordinary malady. The noble's daughter had been stricken with a very serious curse, but the mystic could cure her. The bad news was that such a powerful malady required an equally dark cure. In this case, that meant a very rare and gruesome ingredient: the liver of a pregnant woman, one who was almost ready to give birth. Iwate was horrified, as were the other attendants present. The only face not twisted in disgust was the lord of the house. He listened intently, desperately. The mystic agreed to prepare the cure if the lord could acquire the horrible ingredient. Iwate adored the lord's daughter, but couldn't imagine killing anyone, let alone a pregnant woman, just for a chance at curing the young lady. After the mystic left, the lord approached Iwate. He asked Iwate to go out and get the liver. The lord had done so much for Iwate and her daughter, but this was one request she couldn't possibly fulfill. She prostrated herself before her lord and begged him not to make her do this dark deed. Seeing that Iwate wasn't willingly going to go along, his face grew cold and he ordered her to do it. Iwate was horrified. He ordered her to travel far away, since the noble family must not be tied to the murder of a pregnant woman. He smiled to Iwate and said that, while she was absent, the noble family would look after Iwate's daughter as if she were their own. Return with the liver or not at all, that was the order. Iwate resigned herself to the most insidious of tasks, but before she set out on her long journey, she visited the local temple and bought an omamori, a protective charm for her daughter. She explained to her daughter that she would be gone for a while, she didn't know how long exactly, on an important task for their lord, and that while the lord would look after her, she should wear this omamori always, as a reminder of her mother's love for her. Her daughter cried and hugged her tightly. Iwate set out the next morning alone and headed north for Mutsu province, far from Kyoto. Her journey was difficult and long. She braved terrible torrential rains, terrible snowstorms, but eventually she made it to Mutsu. She set herself up in an old abandoned hut in the forest of Adachigahara, and she waited. But opportunities were far and few between. There were few suitable targets in those first few years. Rarely did pregnant women about to give birth make their way through the forest alone, and when they did, they usually were accompanied by their husbands or other family members. Iwate was just one lone woman. She couldn't take on multiple protectors by herself, so the months turned to years as she continued to wait. It was an intolerable existence. She longed to see her daughter again, crying herself to sleep. Food was also scarce and she was often hungry. But until she got that liver, she couldn't return. Iwate spent many years waiting in that hut. She no longer knew exactly how many, but her face had marked the time, wrinkled as it was. She was always hungry, always waiting. But on this dark night, finally, after so many years, opportunity knocked on her door. She opened the rickety door to find a young couple standing drenched. The young wife, beautiful, her belly swollen with child. The young man, handsome and polite, explained that they had been traveling on family business, and not being from the area had gotten lost. The man asked if they could stay the night in Iwate's hut to escape the rain and that they would resume their journey in the morning once the storm passed. Iwate smiled and waved them in. They huddled around the stove, drying themselves off. Iwate apologized that she didn't have anything more to offer the young couple than some very thin okayu, rice gruel. The couple were gracious and thanked Iwate for her hospitality. As the couple ate, Iwate couldn't help but stare at the young wife. Iwate found herself thinking of her daughter. She wondered what her daughter looked like now. How long she'd been left without her mother. A tear began to well up at the corner of Iwate's eye when her reverie was broken by a sudden groan from the young wife. She was holding her belly. The baby was coming. The husband jumped up excitedly. Did Iwate have any medicine or painkillers? No? Where could I get some? Iwate told the young husband there was a village some ways down the path, that they would have some medicine there. It was still raining and dark, but as long as he stayed on the path, he couldn't miss it. The young man thanked Iwate, kissed his wife, and ran out into the pouring rain, promising to be back soon with the medicine. Iwate had left out that the village had been abandoned for some years now, but by the time he discovered that and had returned, Iwate's dark task would be complete, and she would be on the way back to Kyoto at long last. As the door to the shack slammed shut, Iwate helped the young woman move towards Iwate's humble bed, nothing more than a pile of straw and hay. As the young woman leaned back, trying to get comfortable, Iwate, with a nimbleness that belied her elderly appearance, quickly tied the woman up with a sturdy rope. Just as the woman was realizing what was happening and about to cry out, Iwate slipped a gag into the woman's mouth, stifling her cries. The gag was for Iwate's sake. She took no pleasure in what she was about to do, and did not want the woman's pleading to possibly break her resolve. She worked feverishly, sharpening the knife, avoiding looking at the face of the young woman, who repeatedly screamed into her gag. Iwate tried to focus her mind. Don't think of the young woman, just think of your daughter. The sooner this is over, the sooner you will see your daughter again, she told herself. She threw the other end of the rope over a beam in the rafters and hoisted the bound and gagged woman into the air. It was no easy task for Iwate, old and frail as she was. Finally, her long, horrible task was nearly over. She spun the bound woman around and undid her kimono, exposing the round belly. The woman was saying something over and over, but the gag muffled it all. Iwate, with tears streaming down her face, looked up at the young woman and said, "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry," and then plunged the sharp knife into the woman's belly. The woman was screaming now as Iwate cut into her flesh. It was taking longer than she expected, but there was just so much flesh, so much blood. Iwate felt sick but kept cutting. The young woman's last words, muffled by the gag though they were calling out to her mother over and over. Iwate could hardly see as she cut and slashed. Her own tears came so heavy. She had to get to the liver. The woman was silent, dead now, motionless except for the occasional muscle twitch as Iwate cut. Finally, she found the liver and cut around the organ and pulled it free, falling to the ground with the liver in her blood-soaked hands. The young woman, lifeless, bound, and split open, swinging from the rafter overhead. Finally, she had it. Finally, she could go home and see her daughter. It was all over now. As she began to sit up, still cradling the liver in her hands like a baby, something fell from the dead woman overhead. It landed in between Iwate's legs. She looked at it and froze. No, it couldn't be. It can't be. A coincidence. It had to be. Please, let it be. The object that had landed on the ground was an omamori. Not just any omamori, but the exact same protection omamori from the same temple in Kyoto she had gotten the one for her daughter. Iwate scrambled to her feet, dropping the liver onto the ground without a thought. She cut the dead woman down and began looking through her clothes. I haven't been gone that long. It can't be her. It's not possible. It can't be true. How long has it been? The questions raced through her mind as she searched for anything to prove this was just a horrible coincidence. But she could see her daughter's face and the face of this young woman. Iwata felt a surge of terrible blackness building up in her from somewhere deep down. Then she found it. Some papers in the woman's kimono. Iwata unfolded it and read it. It was a journal. The young woman had come from Kyoto and was apparently searching for her mother. The journal started out by saying that she was proud and thankful to her mother, that she knew her mother had been away on an important assignment all these years. It continued that the lord of their house, his daughter, had managed to overcome her strange illness on her own accord, and the lord of the house was releasing the mother from her duty and to return to Kyoto. The lord had dispatched the daughter and her husband to bring the mother home. There was more. The young woman had apparently not been pregnant when they had set off, and had only become so while on their search. The young woman talked of how joyous the day would be when she found her mother, for she would not only be reuniting with her mother, but introducing her mother to her grandchild. Iwate could read no more, there was no doubt. She felt a madness coming forth as she stared at the scene around her. The pool of blood, the dead woman, no, her dead daughter, her belly slashed open by her own hand. Iwate retreated into a corner of the hut, shrinking down into the shadows, staring at her dead daughter's face, the grandchild that never would be. There was nothing left for her. Everything had been for nothing. She spent the rest of the night just staring from the shadows as the storm raged outside. When morning came, the only things Iwate felt were hunger and hate. Hate for herself, hate for the world, hate for the cruelness of the gods, and an insatiable hunger, and she was surrounded by so much meat. Iwate no longer existed. In her stead was a creature of hate and hunger, an Onibaba. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed my rendition of the origin of the Onibaba. The original tale of the Onibaba comes from Fukushima. The major story beats are the same as the tale I just told, however, there is no mention of a smallpox outbreak or anything of the sort in the original. In the original, Iwate doesn't seem to need any further motivation to do this other than adoring the noble's daughter, and Iwate doesn't seem to have any real reluctance at needing to kill a pregnant woman. Also, the original story basically ends when the omamori is revealed. Iwate basically recognizes instantly that it's her daughter. In some variations of this story, it's not the pregnant woman's liver, but the fetus of the pregnant woman that is needed. In the original tales, the story doesn't end here, though. Sometime later in the 720s, a monk stumbles upon the Onibaba's cave. The monk seeks shelter with the Onibaba, who appears as an old woman. The old woman welcomes him in and then says she's going to go out to get some firewood for their supper. However, she cautions him not to look into her room. The monk gets suspicious about the statement and sneaks a peek while she's out. Inside, he finds a mountain of human bones and realizes the old woman is the Onibaba, because the Onibaba has been reputed to be a cannibal and eats travelers that it catches. He then flees the cave. The old woman returns and realizes the monk has discovered her identity. So she sets off after the monk after transforming into the monstrous Onibaba. Just as she's about to catch the monk turns and places a small Buddhist statue on the ground and begins chanting. The statue then rises up into the sky and becomes a shining white bow and arrow and slays the Onibaba. The monk then buries the Onibaba's body next to the Abukuma River, at the foot of a tree. This site is called Kudazuka, and is actually a real place. A couple of variations to this are in some versions, instead of a bow and arrow, it's just thunder and lightning that strikes down the Onibaba. And in yet another variation of this story, the monk Yokai, instead of accidentally running into the Onibaba, he has been sent specifically to hunt her down, due to the stories of her eating all of the travelers in the forest. There are many different variations of this story. There are also very similar stories found in other locations across Japan. Saitama, Kochi, Morioka all have their own renditions of this story. Well, that concludes this episode. A quick update on the Aokigahara episode. I had hoped to have the Aokigahara Ghostly Japan video up before this one, but that's taking a bit longer than planned. It should drop in about a week. I wish everyone a happy Halloween and hope to see you in the next installment of Ghostly Japan.